What if I told you there was a punishment so utterly terrifying, so unbelievably cruel, a method of execution that makes every other form of capital punishment throughout history seem almost merciful by comparison? Imagine a form of torture so profoundly disturbing that its victims did not simply die. Instead, they deteriorated, trapped within the confines of their own failing bodies. They remained fully aware, conscious of their slow, inexorable, and agonizing fate. This was a unique and dreadful sentence designed for maximum suffering. For many long and shadowed centuries, this horrific method remained one of history's darkest, most closely guarded secrets. Its details were spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones, whispered by those who dared to recall its existence. The full extent of its horrors was almost too gruesome, too nightmarish for the human mind to truly believe or to fully comprehend. It represents a chilling and disturbing chapter in the annals of human cruelty. Known to only a select few, it was deeply feared by all who understood its true nature, a testament to the human capacity for inventive malice and brutality. This punishment was not conceived merely to end a person's life. Its purpose was far more sinister, far more profound than simple execution. It aimed to break an individual completely, to shatter not just their body but their spirit, their identity, their very essence of being. The goal was to turn them into something beyond human recognition, a grotesque spectacle of slow, deliberate, and agonizing annihilation. It was a public display of power, intended to leave an indelible mark on the psyche of all who witnessed or heard of it, ensuring compliance through terror. We are now about to delve into this abyss of darkness. We will explore the chilling and disturbing story behind this ancient method of torment. A punishment known to history by the name of Scaphism. It is quite possibly the most disturbing and drawn-out form of execution ever devised by humankind. It is a name that you may never have encountered before in your studies of the past. Prepare yourself to uncover a truly terrifying aspect of our shared human history, a grim reminder of the depths to which cruelty can descend when power is unchecked. So, what exactly was this dreadful and infamous practice? Try to picture this. You are confined, trapped, but not within a simple wooden coffin destined for burial. This particular coffin was not designed to be interred underground, hidden from view. Instead, it was made to float exposed upon the still and often murky surface of a stagnant body of water like a remote pond or a fetid swamp. Crucially, your head, your arms, and your legs remained protruding from this confinement, left utterly exposed and vulnerable to the relentless elements and the ensuing torment that was to come. Once secured in this horrifying contraption, you were then forcibly fed. Large quantities of rich food and drink, often milk and honey, were poured down your throat. But this act of sustenance was no gesture of compassion, no fleeting moment of mercy from your captors. No, this forced nourishment was, in fact, a crucial and diabolical part of the overall torture, because what followed this initial force feeding was far more terrifying, far more insidious than the prospect of a quick and relatively merciful death. It was a calculated step towards a deliberately prolonged and unimaginable suffering, a cruel biological trick. This horrifying scenario, this living nightmare, was not merely a figment of some dark imagination or a tale from macabre fiction. It was, according to some historical sources, a grim and terrible reality, a method of execution of unparalleled cruelty. It was called Scaphism, though it was also chillingly referred to simply as the boats. Its origins are traced back to the ancient Persian Empire, a civilization known for both its grandeur and its capacity for brutal justice. It is widely believed to have been one of the most brutal and agonizing execution methods ever devised by humankind throughout recorded history. Historical accounts, though some details are debated by modern scholars, paint a truly harrowing picture of this practice. They speak of victims suffering for incredibly extended periods, enduring their fate for days on end. Sometimes this torment could even stretch into weeks before their ravaged and broken bodies finally succumbed to the inevitable. Their life slowly and painfully ebbed away, lost in a haze of unimaginable torment, infection, and despair. But from where did this terrifying term, Scaphism, actually originate? And how have the horrifying details of its existence been passed down to us through the ages? The word Scaphism itself offers a significant and chilling clue to the nature of the punishment. It is derived from the ancient Greek word scaphi. This Greek term translates directly to mean a boat, a skiff, or more generally, any hollowed-out vessel or trough. The name, therefore, directly points to the core mechanism, the primary instrument of this deliberately prolonged and grotesque torment. The condemned individual was typically placed securely between two such small boats, or sometimes within a single, suitably sized, hollowed-out tree trunk, effectively encasing their torso. Once enclosed, they were then abandoned, left to perish in the most excruciating and degrading way imaginable. Although the name Scaphism, by which we know this punishment today, is Greek in origin, the form of execution itself was widely believed to be a Persian invention. It was reportedly used by the Achaemenid Persians, who forged one of the most powerful and expansive empires of the ancient world. This empire, stretching across vast territories, was known for its sophisticated administration, but also for its severe methods of dealing with treason. But why would such a powerful empire devise something so utterly extreme and inhumane? Scaphism was not merely about the straightforward act of taking a human life. Its purpose was far more complex and psychologically driven. It was a calculated act of state-sanctioned terror, a form of psychological warfare waged against its own people and potential enemies. It was designed to make a brutal and unforgettable example out of the condemned individual. It served as a stark and terrifying message, a visceral warning to all who might contemplate defiance or betrayal. Betray the empire? Challenge the absolute authority of the king, and your suffering would become the stuff of dark legends, a horrifying deterrent. The most detailed and frequently cited account of Scaphism that has survived to the present day comes to us from the writings of Plutarch. Plutarch was a renowned Greek historian and biographer who lived centuries after the Achaemenid Empire had fallen. He described this punishment in his work, The Life of Artaxerxes, detailing the grim fate of a Persian soldier. This soldier, named Mithridates, was allegedly sentenced to die by Scaphism for a perceived act of treason. His harrowing story, as recounted by Plutarch, provides a chilling, if contested, glimpse into the mechanics and sheer horror of this ancient practice. The chilling practice of Scaphism did not emerge from a vacuum of chaos. It was born within the sophisticated yet formidable confines of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This colossal empire, flourishing from approximately 550 BC to 330 BC, was one of the largest and most powerful ancient civilizations the world had ever witnessed. Stretching across 3 continents, from the Indus Valley in the east to southeastern Europe in the west, its sheer scale was breathtaking. Such a vast domain required meticulous organization and an unwavering system of control to maintain its integrity and stability against internal and external threats. The Achaemenid rulers, figures like Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and Xerxes I, were architects of a complex administrative system. They established standardized coinage, efficient road networks like the Royal Road, and a sophisticated postal service. These innovations facilitated trade, communication, and the swift movement of armies across their sprawling territories. However, this emphasis on order and efficiency was underpinned by an absolute insistence on loyalty. The great king, the Shahanshah, or King of Kings, was not merely a political leader. He was often viewed as a divinely appointed figure, the embodiment of the empire itself, demanding complete and unquestioning obedience from all his subjects. Maintaining cohesion across such a diverse empire, encompassing myriad cultures, languages, and local traditions, was a monumental challenge. The Persians were often tolerant of local customs, allowing a degree of autonomy. Yet this tolerance had its limits, especially when the central authority of the king or the stability of the empire was perceived to be at risk. Any act of rebellion, sedition, or serious insubordination was met with swift and often brutal responses. The empire's survival depended on projecting an image of unassailable power, where defiance was met with consequences too dire to contemplate, ensuring that potential dissidents thought twice. It is within this context of imperial grandeur, logistical complexity, and the paramount need for absolute control that the origins of punishments like Scaphism must be understood. The Achaemenids were innovators in governance and infrastructure, but they were also pragmatic rulers who understood the potent role of fear in maintaining dominion. The very existence of such an empire relied on its capacity to enforce its will. Therefore, the development of extreme punitive measures served as a stark reminder to all inhabitants of the severe price of disloyalty, helping to preserve the colossal structure of the Persian state from fracturing under pressure. The legal system of the Achaemenid Persian Empire was a structured framework deeply influenced by Zoroastrian principles of truth and justice, known as laws were codified and a system of judges and courts was in place to administer them throughout the satrapies or provinces. For many common offences, punishments could be relatively measured, sometimes involving fines, flogging, or imprisonment. The empire prided itself on a degree of fairness in its legal proceedings for ordinary matters. However, this semblance of leniency evaporated entirely when the crime concerned the state, the king, or the fundamental order of the empire. Treason was the ultimate transgression. Acts deemed treasonous, such as plotting against the king, aiding enemies of the empire, desertion from the formidable Persian army, or inciting rebellion, were met with an iron fist. There was little room for mercy or clemency in such cases. The Persians believed that the stability of their vast realm, the peace and prosperity it offered, depended entirely on the unshakable authority of the king. Any challenge to this authority was not merely a crime against an individual ruler, but an attack on the divine order and the very fabric of society. Therefore, the response had to be severe, decisive, and overwhelmingly terrifying. The concept of making an example was a cornerstone of Persian penal philosophy for high crimes. The punishment was not solely about retribution for the guilty party. It was a public spectacle, a didactic display of power designed to instill fear and ensure obedience in the wider populace. The suffering of one was intended to serve as a vivid and unforgettable lesson for thousands, if not millions. This philosophy paved the way for the creation and implementation of exceptionally cruel and prolonged methods of execution. The goal was to horrify, to leave an indelible psychological scar on anyone who witnessed or even heard tell of such a fate. Thus, while the Persian Empire is often lauded for its administrative genius and cultural tolerance, its mechanisms for dealing with perceived threats to its core were uncompromisingly harsh. The king's law in matters of state security was absolute and unforgiving. Punishments were designed not just to eliminate the offender, but to send a clear, unambiguous message across the empire's vast expanse. Loyalty was paramount, and the consequences of betrayal were beyond the worst imaginings of ordinary men. This set the stage for the adoption of methods like Scaphism, which embodied this principle of exemplary, terrifying justice to its fullest, most grotesque extent. Scaphism was not born out of spontaneous, uncontrolled rage or a simple desire for sadistic pleasure on the part of individual executioners. Its development and application were far more calculated, stemming from a clear understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of power. The Achaemenid rulers, in their quest to maintain dominion over a colossal and diverse empire, recognized that mere military might was not always sufficient. They needed to control not only the bodies but also the minds of their subjects. Fear, when expertly wielded, could be a far more effective and pervasive tool of governance than legions of soldiers alone. The primary purpose of Scaphism, therefore, was deterrence. It was a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes, particularly treason and acts that directly challenged the king's authority or threatened imperial stability. By subjecting individuals to such an unbelievably protracted and agonizing death, the Persian authorities aimed to create a spectacle of horror so profound that it would dissuade anyone else from contemplating similar transgressions. The story of the victim's suffering would spread, amplified by fear and rumor, serving as a constant, chilling reminder of the price of disloyalty. The very name of the punishment would evoke terror. Beyond general deterrence, Scaphism also served to reinforce the absolute power and ruthlessness of the king. In a world where power was often demonstrated through displays of overwhelming force, such an extreme form of execution underscored the king's capacity to inflict unimaginable suffering on those who defied him. It was a statement that his reach was total, his wrath inescapable, and his methods of retribution beyond common comprehension. This helped to elevate the king above ordinary mortals, instilling a sense of awe and trepidation that discouraged potential rivals and quelled simmering dissent before it could ignite into open rebellion. Furthermore, the specific nature of Scaphism, the slow decay, the infestation by insects, the helplessness, was a form of ultimate degradation. It stripped the victim of all dignity, reducing them to a tormented, decaying object. This dehumanization was a crucial part of its psychological impact. It wasn't just about ending a life. It was about obliterating the individual's identity and humanity in the most public and grotesque manner possible. For an empire built on order and the king's supreme authority, such a complete unmaking of an enemy served as a powerful symbol of the consequences of disrupting that divinely sanctioned order. Our knowledge of Scaphism comes to us primarily through the writings of ancient Greek authors, most notably Plutarch, a biographer and historian who lived several centuries after the Achaemenid Persian Empire had fallen to Alexander the Great. In his Life of Artaxerxes II, Plutarch provides the most detailed and infamous account of Scaphism, describing the execution of Mithridates, a Persian soldier. Mithridates was condemned for allegedly boasting about killing Cyrus the Younger, a claim that undermined King Artaxerxes II's own narrative of the event. Plutarch's description outlines the force-feeding with milk and honey and the subsequent torment by insects. It is crucial to consider the context of these accounts. Greek writers often depicted their traditional adversaries, the Persians, in a negative light, sometimes exaggerating their perceived barbarity and cruelty to create a stark contrast with Greek customs and values. This historical bias, often termed Orientalism in later scholarship, means that some details in accounts like Plutarch's might have been embellished for dramatic effect or to serve a particular narrative purpose. Consequently, some modern historians express skepticism regarding the precise accuracy or widespread use of Scaphism as described, pointing to the lack of corroborating Persian sources detailing the practice. However, the absence of Persian records explicitly naming or detailing Scaphism does not entirely negate its possible existence in some form. The ancient world was a brutal place, and many empires employed horrific methods of torture and execution designed to instill terror. The Romans, for example, utilized crucifixion extensively, a similarly prolonged and agonizing public execution. Given the Achaemenid Empire's documented severity in punishing treason and the value placed on exemplary punishments, a method as horrific as Scaphism or variations thereof remains within the realm of historical plausibility, even if its frequency or exact procedure is debated. Other later writers, such as the 12th century Byzantine historian Joannes Zonaras, also mentioned Scaphism, largely drawing upon Plutarch's earlier work but helping to keep its gruesome memory alive through the centuries. While direct archaeological evidence for Scaphism is understandably non-existent, the enduring nature of these textual accounts, coupled with our understanding of the political and penal philosophies of the Achaemenid era, suggests that the core elements of this punishment, prolonged exposure, biological decay, and psychological torment, likely reflect a grim reality of ancient justice designed to secure power through ultimate fear. The horror began with chilling finality. The sentence of Scaphism was passed. For the condemned, these were their last moments of anything resembling normalcy. Their world narrowed to this single, terrifying fate. Hope, if any lingered, was a fragile thing. It was soon to be systematically crushed. The process was designed to break them from the very outset, even before the physical torment truly began. Every step was a calculated move towards utter despair and dehumanization. Then came the stripping. Every piece of clothing was torn away. With their garments, their dignity was forcibly removed. Their humanity felt like it was being peeled off, layer by layer. They stood naked, utterly vulnerable before their tormentors. This was not just about physical exposure, it was a profound act of humiliation. It was the first stage in reducing a thinking, feeling person to a mere object of punishment, a spectacle of suffering for all to potentially witness. Next, the condemned was forced into the wooden structure. Often this was two narrow boats. One was placed beneath them, the other inverted on top. Sometimes a hollowed-out tree trunk served this grim purpose. The design was cruelly deliberate. Their head, arms, and legs protruded. They were left exposed to the world outside. But their torso remained tightly, immovably trapped within the wooden confines. There was no room to shift, no way to find even a moment's comfort. Once inside, the boats were sealed shut. The victim was now helpless. They were trapped in a floating wooden prison. This prison would soon become their tomb. At first, perhaps a flicker of disbelief lingered. Maybe they hoped for a quick end, a merciful blade. But Scaphism was not about quick deaths. It was engineered for prolonged agony. The horrifying realization would dawn. Their suffering was just beginning, and escape was truly impossible. The dread must have been overwhelming. The next stage of the torture was even more disturbing. It introduced a cruel, deceptive twist. Executioners would approach the trapped victim. They carried bowls filled with a rich mixture. This mixture was typically milk and honey. It might have momentarily seemed like an act of sustenance, perhaps a brief, confusing respite from the inevitable. But this was no kindness. It was a carefully planned element of their prolonged suffering, a truly diabolical invention. The victim was then force-fed. They had no choice in the matter. Whether they wanted to eat or not was irrelevant. The sticky, sweet concoction was poured down their throat. They were forced to swallow again and again. This continued until their stomachs were painfully full, bloated and distended. The initial discomfort of this forced ingestion was only a precursor. The true purpose of this meal was far more sinister. It was designed to turn their own body against them in a horrific way. What the unfortunate victim often didn't realize was the devastating biological effect. Milk and honey, especially when consumed in such excessive quantities, are known to cause severe, uncontrollable diarrhea. Since the victim was tightly confined within the wooden enclosure, they had no way to relieve themselves cleanly. There was no escape from their own bodily functions. Within hours, their lower body would be covered in their own excrement. This created a truly foul and unsanitary environment. This disgusting process was not a one-time event. It would be repeated day after day. The executioners meticulously ensured the victim did not starve too quickly. They needed them to remain alive, to endure. The regular force feeding sustained their life, but only to prolong the unspeakable horrors that were yet to unfold. Each feeding was a renewed promise of continued agony. The victim's own waste would become a breeding ground for infection and further torment, a key part of the design. As the victim lay trapped in their own accumulating filth, the insects inevitably arrived. The stench of waste and the sweetness of honey proved an irresistible summons. To hasten this process, the executioners would often smear more honey directly onto the victim's exposed skin. Their face, neck, hands and feet were deliberately coated. This sticky, sickly sweet substance acted as a potent lure. It was an open invitation to the myriad crawling and flying creatures of the area. The first wave of tormentors would soon descend. Flies, ants and other vermin swarmed eagerly. They crawled onto the helpless, exposed body of the victim. They began to bite and sting relentlessly as they fed on the honey and the festering waste. The more the victim struggled, if they had any strength left to do so, the more attention they attracted. Wasps and bees, drawn by the scent of honey and movement, would join the assault. They would sting the exposed flesh repeatedly, adding to the mounting agony. There was no escape from this onslaught. The victim was completely immobilized. They could not swat away the creatures. They could not shield their skin. The constant biting and stinging would cause intense irritation. Swelling would quickly follow, making the tight bonds of the boat even more unbearable. The pain might have been tolerable at first in isolated stings, but over time, as the numbers of insects grew, it became an unrelenting wave of torture, driving the sufferer towards madness. Then came an even more repulsive stage, the maggots. Flies, having found the perfect breeding ground in the filth and any open wounds, would lay their eggs. Soon these eggs would hatch. Writhing larvae or maggots would emerge. They would begin to burrow into the victim's skin, feeding on the decaying flesh and waste. The victim was still alive. They were fully conscious. They could feel every sickening movement as these creatures feasted upon their living body. Infections would rapidly take hold. Days would bleed into one another. With each passing day, dehydration became another relentless tormentor. The victim was left utterly exposed to the elements. Under the merciless glare of the sun, their skin would crack and blister. The intense heat beat down on them hour after hour. There was no shade, no relief from its scorching rays. Their body temperature would soar, adding to their misery and accelerating their decline. The sun itself became an instrument of their torture, baking them alive. The need for water became an all-consuming agony. Their lips would become dry, chapped, and eventually split. Their throats felt parched and raw, as if lined with sandpaper. They would undoubtedly beg for water, for a single drop of clean, cool liquid. But their pleas would likely go unanswered, or worse. All they typically received was more of the milk and honey mixture. This was just enough to keep them alive, to prolong their suffering, but never enough to truly quench their desperate burning thirst. Nightfall brought no true comfort, only a different kind of suffering. As the sun disappeared, the temperatures would often plummet. This sudden change brought on violent, uncontrollable shivering. Excruciating muscle cramps would rack their already tormented body. Sleep, if it came at all, would be fleeting and filled with nightmares. The cold would seep into their bones, a stark contrast to the day's heat, but equally agonizing. There was no escape from this cycle of extreme environmental stress. All the while, the conditions inside the boat grew steadily more abhorrent. The stench of their own festering waste, mixed with decaying food and the smell of infection, would be overpowering. It was a constant, nauseating reminder of their state. This filth was not just disgusting, it was dangerous. It attracted more pests and provided a fertile ground for bacteria. The victim was immersed in a pool of their own degradation, a truly hellish existence that attacked every single one of their senses. As the days wore on, infections began to ravage the victim's body. The open sores created by insect bites, pressure, and the constant immersion in filth would quickly become infected. These wounds would fill with pus. The surrounding flesh would turn a sickly black. It would begin to rot away, quite literally. The process of decay, normally associated with death, was happening while the victim was still alive. Conscious of their own decomposition, their body was failing piece by agonizing piece. In some accounts, victims were deliberately placed near swamps or stagnant bodies of water. This exposed them to even greater, more diverse horrors. Mosquitoes would feast on their blood, potentially transmitting diseases. Leeches might attach themselves to any submerged parts of their body. Even small rodents, like rats, could be drawn by the scent of festering flesh. These animals might gnaw at exposed fingers and toes, sometimes even chewing through skin while the victim was still alive, adding unimaginable terror to their suffering. The human body can only endure so much. After an unbearable period, sometimes lasting for days, often for weeks, it would begin to shut down. The horrific combination of severe dehydration, massive spreading infection, the onset of septic shock and utter exhaustion would finally take its cumulative toll. The victim's heart would grow weaker, their breathing would become more shallow, more labored. The boundaries between consciousness and delirium would blur into a final hazy torment. Finally, after untold days and nights of unimaginable suffering, death would arrive. It came not as a swift release, but as a slow, reluctant surrender. The victim slipped from torment into the embrace of oblivion. But for those who witnessed or knew of Scaphism, the true horror did not end there. Scaphism was not merely a physical endurance test, it was a meticulous and brutal assault on the human psyche. The psychological torment began the very moment the victim understood their fate. Imagine the sheer terror of being confined, immobile, within the narrow, suffocating space between two boats or a hollowed log. This physical entrapment was absolute, but it also created an unseen cage for the mind. The knowledge that there was no escape, no possibility of reprieve, would have been the first crushing blow. Every sunrise promised only another day of horror, every sunset a night of dread. The initial shock would slowly give way to a horrifying clarity. The victim would realize that this was not a swift execution. It was a carefully orchestrated descent into prolonged agony. This dawning awareness, the understanding that their suffering was intentional and designed to be drawn out, would have been a source of profound mental anguish. The mind, desperate for an end, would instead be forced to contemplate an agonizingly slow decay. This period of realization, trapped and helpless, must have been a torment in itself, a prelude to the physical horrors that were relentlessly unfolding around them and within them. Even if the execution was public, the victim was profoundly isolated, surrounded by onlookers perhaps, yet utterly alone in their unique and terrible suffering. They could see the world, but they could not interact with it. They might hear voices, but their own pleas would be for naught. This forced passivity, the inability to act, to fight back, or even to shield oneself, would have been psychologically devastating. The human spirit, which naturally seeks agency and control, was systematically denied any outlet, leading to a profound sense of powerlessness that corroded the will to live long before the body gave out. The sheer helplessness would amplify every physical sensation into a psychological wound. Each insect bite, each pang of hunger or thirst before the next force feeding, each wave of nausea from the filth was not just a physical event, but a reminder of their complete subjugation. The mind, unable to escape the body's torment, would turn inward, potentially replaying memories, imagining impossible escapes, or succumbing to a numb despair. This internal battle, fought in the silent, dark confines of their consciousness, was perhaps as torturous as the visible decay of their flesh, a hidden realm of suffering. The psychological torture inherent in Scaphism was deeply intertwined with the systematic destruction of the victim's dignity. Long before the insects began their gruesome feast, the process of dehumanization was well underway. Being stripped naked in public or before one's executioners was an immediate and profound humiliation. This act alone served to rob the individual of their social identity, reducing them to a vulnerable, exposed state. It was a clear message. You are no longer a person with rights or standing. You are now merely an object upon which our power will be demonstrated for all to see. The act of force-feeding, while seemingly a means of prolonging life, was also a deeply degrading experience. The victim was treated like an animal, their bodily autonomy completely overridden. The rich mixture of milk and honey, which would soon turn their own body against them, was a cruel parody of sustenance. This forced ingestion, coupled with the inability to control their subsequent bodily functions, plunged them into a state of abject filth. To be forced to lie in one's own excrement day after day was an assault on the very core of human self-respect. A constant, foul reminder of their debased condition. As their body became a breeding ground for insects and began to decay, the victim witnessed their own transformation into something they would not recognize. They were no longer just a prisoner, they were becoming a grotesque spectacle, a living carrion. The knowledge that they were being consumed alive, that their flesh was rotting while their mind was still aware, would have been an almost unbearable psychological burden. This erosion of the physical self would inevitably lead to an erosion of their sense of identity, blurring the lines between human and horrifying creature in their own tormented perception. If the execution was public, the humiliation was magnified exponentially. The stares of onlookers, whether of pity, disgust, or morbid curiosity, would have been a constant source of shame and anguish. To be observed in such a degraded state, helpless and decaying, stripped of all privacy and control, would have been a final, crushing blow to any remaining sense of self-worth. The victim was not just dying, they were being unmade, their humanity systematically dismantled in the most public and shameful way imaginable, a process designed to break the spirit as thoroughly as the body. The psychological torment of Scaphism was amplified by the relentless sensory assault the victim endured. There was no respite, no moment of peace from the horrors that besieged them. Their sense of smell would be overwhelmed by the nauseating stench of their own feces, urine, and decaying flesh, mingled with the sickly sweet smell of honey and the fetid odor of stagnant water if placed near a swamp. This constant olfactory nightmare would be a suffocating presence, a reminder of their putrefying state from which there was absolutely no escape, not even for a single breath. Their hearing would be filled with the incessant buzzing of flies, the crawling sounds of ants and maggots, perhaps the chirping of crickets or the croaking of frogs if near water. These sounds, the soundtrack to their slow demise, would drill into their consciousness, a constant reminder of the tiny creatures that were their cellmates and consumers. The absence of human conversation, replaced by the noises of decay and infestation, would further isolate them, pushing them deeper into a world where their only companions were the instruments of their torture, a truly maddening symphony of horror. The sense of touch would become an unceasing source of agony and revulsion. They would feel the sticky honey on their skin, the irritation of countless insect bites and stings, the burning of sun-scorched flesh, and the chilling dampness of night. Most horrifically, they would feel the movement of maggots burrowing into their wounds, a sensation so vile it is almost beyond comprehension. The inability to scratch an itch, to wipe away a crawling insect, or to shift their body to alleviate pressure sores would transform their own skin into a landscape of perpetual torment. This constant barrage of negative sensory input would inevitably lead to a profound psychological breakdown. The mind, unable to process or escape the overwhelming stimuli, might begin to distort reality. Hallucinations, vivid nightmares bleeding into waking consciousness, and paranoia could take hold. The victim might lose the ability to distinguish between the external torture and the internal unraveling of their sanity, their senses. The very tools we use to navigate and understand the world would betray them, becoming conduits for nothing but pain, disgust, and terror, accelerating their descent into madness. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Scaphism's psychological battery was the systematic annihilation of hope. In most dire situations, humans cling to the possibility of rescue, escape, or at least a swift end to suffering. Scaphism was engineered to extinguish this vital spark. The daily return of the executioners, not with a blade of mercy but with more milk and honey, served as a recurring confirmation that their torment was to be deliberately prolonged. Each sunrise brought not a new chance but a guarantee of continued and likely worsening agony. The sheer duration of the ordeal played a critical role in this mental erosion. As days bled into weeks, any initial hope for a miraculous intervention or a change of heart from their captors would wither and die. The victim was trapped in a horrifying limbo, a living death from which there was no foreseeable exit except the one they were being forced to endure inch by agonizing inch. This extended timeline allowed the full weight of their predicament to settle in, crushing the spirit under the immense burden of unending suffering, a slow, grinding despair. The mind, faced with inescapable and prolonged trauma, would struggle to cope. Some victims might have retreated into catatonia, a mental shutdown as a defense mechanism against the overwhelming horror. Others might have succumbed to madness, their thoughts fracturing under the relentless pressure. The very concept of time could become distorted, hours stretching into eternities, each moment filled with fresh torments. The psychological mechanisms that allow humans to endure hardship are predicated on the idea that suffering is finite. Scaphism challenged this fundamental expectation in the cruelest way imaginable. Ultimately, death itself would transform from a feared outcome into a desperately longed-for release. The psychological torture reached its zenith when the victim's primary desire became the cessation of their own existence. The idea of obliteration, once terrifying, would appear as a merciful escape from a reality far worse than any imagined hell. Scaphism's true horror lay in its ability to push individuals beyond the limits of human endurance, to a point where the mind, utterly broken, prayed for the body to finally fail, seeking solace only in the finality of death's embrace. When we delve into the shadowy history of Scaphism, one name stands above all others as the primary source: Plutarch. This renowned Greek biographer and essayist, who later became a Roman citizen, is our main window into this horrifying practice. He lived from roughly 46 AD to 120 AD, centuries after the Achaemenid Persian Empire had crumbled under the might of Alexander the Great. Despite this temporal distance, his writings have profoundly shaped our understanding, or perhaps our enduring image, of what Scaphism entailed. His vivid descriptions have echoed through history, ensuring this punishment's dark fame. Plutarch's most detailed account of Scaphism appears in his work, Life of Artaxerxes. Here he recounts the dreadful fate of a Persian soldier named Mithridates, This soldier's crime was not one of grand betrayal in battle, but rather a foolish boast. Mithridates claimed he had delivered the fatal blow to Cyrus the Younger, King Artaxerxes II's rebellious brother. This contradicted the king's own narrative. For this transgression, Mithridates was condemned to the boats. Plutarch graphically describes the force-feeding of milk and honey, the confinement, the swarming insects, and the agonizing 17 days Mithridates supposedly endured before death finally offered its release. It is crucial to understand the context of Plutarch's writings. He was a Greek intellectual, writing for an audience steeped in Hellenic culture and its historical perspectives on Persia. His sources for events that transpired hundreds of years before his time were likely other Greek historians or deeply ingrained oral traditions. He would not have had direct access to pristine Achaemenid state archives if such detailed penal records even existed or survived. Therefore, his narrative is filtered through layers of time and cultural interpretation, which historians must carefully consider when evaluating its claims. The enduring impact of Plutarch's account cannot be overstated. Its graphic detail and compelling narrative have made it the definitive, albeit highly controversial, description of Scaphism. Because his works were widely read and preserved, the story of Mithridates' torment has cemented Scaphism's place in the grim catalogue of history's most extreme punishments. This vivid portrayal continues to fascinate and horrify, even as scholars debate its complete factual accuracy and the extent to which it represents a common Persian practice or an exceptional, perhaps embellished horror. The power of his story keeps the debate alive. One of the most significant challenges in verifying the historical reality of Scaphism, as described by Plutarch, is the profound silence from Persian sources. The Achaemenid Empire, known for its sophisticated administration, left behind various records, including cuneiform tablets like those found at Persepolis. These tablets detail aspects of governance, economy, and royal decrees. Yet among these surviving indigenous records, there is no clear, undisputed mention of a punishment specifically named Scaphism, nor a detailed description matching Plutarch's account. This conspicuous absence forms a central pillar of the historical debate. What are we to make of this silence? Does it definitively prove that Scaphism was a Greek invention, a piece of macabre fiction? Not necessarily. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Perhaps the practice was exceedingly rare, reserved for only the most extreme cases of treason, and thus not widely documented. It's also conceivable that such a shameful and horrific punishment was deliberately omitted from official records, or that records detailing it were lost over the millennia, or it might have been known by a different Persian name, its description obscured in texts we have yet to fully understand. We must also consider the nature and purpose of the Persian records that have survived to this day. Many of these documents focus on grand royal achievements, administrative logistics, economic transactions, or religious dedications. Detailed penal codes or explicit step-by-step descriptions of every execution method employed across the vast empire might not have been a priority for monumental inscriptions or long-term archival preservation. Such grim details might have been recorded on more perishable materials like parchment or papyrus, which have rarely survived the harsh conditions of time in that region. While the specific, elaborate torment of Scaphism, as detailed by Plutarch, finds no direct echo in Persian texts, it is undeniable that the Achaemenid rulers were capable of extreme brutality in punishing their enemies. Other severe punishments, such as impalement, mutilation, and being thrown to wild animals, are attested or strongly suggested by historical and archaeological evidence. The Achaemenid state certainly understood the power of exemplary cruelty to maintain order and deter rebellion. So the spirit of inflicting terrifying, prolonged suffering was present. even if this particular method remains shrouded in uncertainty due to the lack of Persian corroboration. To understand the debate surrounding Scaphism, we must view it through the lens of the long and often bitter relationship between the ancient Greeks and Persians. These two great civilizations were frequent rivals, most famously clashing during the Greco-Persian Wars in the 5th century BC. This history of conflict fostered a deep-seated animosity and a tendency among Greek writers to portray their Eastern adversaries in a particular, often negative light. Persians were frequently characterized in Greek literature as despotic, overly luxurious, effeminate, and, crucially, as practitioners of barbaric and excessive cruelty. This prevailing stereotype of the barbarian Persian likely influenced how Greek historians and writers depicted Persian customs and laws. A punishment as elaborate, grotesque, and drawn out as Scaphism fits almost perfectly into this established narrative. It served to highlight the perceived moral failings and inhumanity of the Persian regime, contrasting it with an often idealized vision of Greek rationality, justice, and moderation. For a Greek audience, stories of such Persian excesses would reinforce their own cultural superiority and the fundamental differences between their civilizations, justifying past conflicts and contemporary prejudices. Plutarch, despite his scholarly intentions and his distance in time from the Achaemenid Empire, was still a product of this Greco-Roman cultural environment. He drew upon earlier Greek historical traditions and sources, many of which were already imbued with these anti-Persian biases. It is plausible, therefore, that the story of Scaphism, as he recounted it, might have been subject to exaggeration or embellishment over time. The core event might have occurred, but its most lurid details could have been amplified to create a more dramatic, shocking, and morally instructive narrative for his readers. Indeed, some scholars have suggested that the tale of Scaphism could have functioned as a form of anti-Persian propaganda, or at least as a narrative that resonated powerfully with existing propaganda tropes. Stories of extreme cruelty committed by a rival power can serve to demonize that enemy, solidify in-group cohesion, and retrospectively justify animosities by portraying the Persians as capable of inventing and inflicting such uniquely horrifying torments. Greek writers could subtly elevate their own civilization as more enlightened and humane, even if the historical reality of punishments in the ancient world was often brutal across many cultures. The historical debate over Scaphism continues among modern scholars, with no definitive consensus yet reached. Historians are divided, their opinions shaped by their interpretation of the limited and often problematic textual evidence. Some are inclined to accept Plutarch's account, if not in every minute detail, then at least in its general outline, suggesting that such a punishment, or something very similar, was indeed part of the Persian penal arsenal. Others approach the claims with profound skepticism, viewing Scaphism as more likely a literary embellishment or a product of cultural bias than a faithfully recorded historical practice. Arguments supporting the potential reality of Scaphism often point to several factors. The ancient world, across many cultures, was no stranger to horrific forms of torture and execution designed for maximum deterrence and public spectacle. The psychological motivation behind such a punishment, to instill absolute terror and make an unforgettable example, is certainly plausible within the context of imperial power maintenance. Furthermore, the consistency of certain gruesome details in the few surviving accounts, though mostly derivative of Plutarch, is noted by some as lending a degree of credence to a core historical event. Conversely, historians who express skepticism emphasize the glaring lack of corroborating evidence from Persian sources themselves, which is a significant hurdle. They highlight the strong tradition of Greek writers portraying Persians in a negative and often exaggeratedly cruel light, suggesting Scaphism could be a prime example of this tendency. The almost fantastical, overly elaborate and theatrical nature of the punishment as described by Plutarch also raises red flags for some, who see it as characteristic of a literary topos of barbarian cruelty rather than a sober historical account of a routine judicial procedure. Ultimately, the absolute, incontrovertible truth about Scaphism, in all its lurid detail, may remain elusive, lost to the ambiguities of ancient history and the biases of its chroniclers. Whether Scaphism was a genuine, regularly practiced Persian punishment, a rare and exceptional atrocity, a significant exaggeration, or largely a figment of Greek imagination, its story endures. It persists as a chilling testament to the human capacity for inventing cruelty and the deep-seated historical fear of extreme, dehumanizing punishments. The ongoing debate itself underscores the complexities historians face when trying to reconstruct the grimmer aspects of the distant past from fragmented and often partisan accounts. Even if the precise details of Scaphism remain shrouded in historical debate, its very idea casts a long and terrifying shadow across the centuries. The name itself has become synonymous with the utmost extremity of human cruelty. It serves as a grim benchmark, a horrifying standard against which other forms of torture are often implicitly measured. The sheer calculated horror embedded in its description ensures that Scaphism is not easily forgotten by those who encounter its story. Its infamy persists, a chilling testament to humanity's darkest inventive capacities when it comes to inflicting pain and terror upon fellow human beings. This enduring notoriety transcends the quest for absolute historical verification, solidifying its place as a dark legend. The survival of Scaphism's gruesome tale through the ages is largely indebted to a few ancient chroniclers. Plutarch, the Greek historian, provided the most vivid and enduring account. His narrative, whether entirely factual or somewhat embellished, seared the horrifying image of the boats into the historical consciousness. Centuries later, Byzantine historian Joannes Zonaras revisited and recounted the punishment, further amplifying its dreadful reputation. Without these written testimonies, the specifics of this particular horror might have dissolved into the mists of time, lost among countless other unrecorded cruelties. The act of committing such a story to parchment gave it a perverse form of immortality, allowing its chilling message to traverse generations. The story of Scaphism has undeniably colored the perception of ancient Persia, particularly in Western historical narratives. Regardless of its actual prevalence or precise nature, accounts of such an appalling punishment contributed significantly to the enduring stereotype of Eastern empires as inherently despotic and barbaric. It became a potent, if contentious, exhibit in the portrayal of Persian civilization as one capable of unimaginable cruelty, often contrasted with an idealized view of Greek or Roman legal practices. This dark stain, fairly or unfairly attributed, has influenced popular and even some scholarly understanding of the Achaemenid Empire for many, many years, shaping its complex legacy in a decidedly sinister way. Beyond the confines of historical scholarship, Scaphism has permeated culture as a powerful touchstone for ultimate suffering and degradation. Its horrifying elements resonate deeply, making it a recurring reference point in discussions about the extremes of human torment. In art, in literature, and even in philosophical explorations of evil, the concept of Scaphism, or punishments echoing its character, serves as a potent metaphor for inescapable, agonizing situations where the victim is slowly consumed. It represents the nadir of human experience, a fate often described as being worse than death itself, its power to shock the conscience remaining undiminished through time. Tracing a direct, unbroken lineage from Scaphism to all subsequent methods of torture is a complex, perhaps impossible task for historians. Yet the horrifying principles underpinning Scaphism, the deliberate prolongation of agony, the public display of humiliation, and the insidious use of natural elements or living creatures as instruments of torment, certainly found echoes in various cruel practices devised by later civilizations across the globe. Scaphism crystallized these elements into a uniquely grotesque package, but the dark human ingenuity that conceived it did not vanish with the Persian Empire. Similar conceptual threads of cruelty have, unfortunately, re-emerged in different forms throughout history. Consider, for example, the Roman practice of crucifixion. While mechanically different from Scaphism, it shared a core philosophy of exemplary suffering. Victims of crucifixion endured prolonged public agony, exposed, shamed, and left to die slowly from exhaustion, asphyxiation, and dehydration. Both methods were designed as powerful deterrents, intended to instill profound fear and unequivocally assert the absolute authority of the state. Both transformed the victim into a spectacle of suffering, their slow death serving as a visceral warning to any who might contemplate defiance. The underlying message of terror delivered through protracted and visible torment was strikingly similar. In the medieval period and beyond, other forms of punishment emerged that, while distinct, evoked some of the same horrors associated with Scaphism. Immurement, the practice of walling individuals up alive, condemned them to a slow, terrifying death from starvation and suffocation in utter darkness. Similarly, the gibbet, where corpses or sometimes still living individuals were hung in iron cages, left them exposed to the elements and to be pecked apart by carrion birds. These methods, like Scaphism, involved a profound degradation, a denial of a quick or dignified end, and the horrifying spectacle of the body slowly succumbing to decay and external forces. The specific notion of employing insects or other small animals as agents of torture also recurs as a chilling motif in the annals of cruelty and in folklore. Stories from various cultures describe victims being coated with substances to attract ants or exposed to rats in confined spaces. While these may not always match the systematic, force-fed horror of Plutarch's Scaphism, the underlying principle of using nature's relentless small creatures to inflict escalating pain and psychological terror is a potent one. Scaphism, in its detailed description, provides a horrifyingly complete archetype for this particular brand of torment, exploiting primal fears of being consumed alive. The sheer narrative power of Scaphism, with its blend of methodical cruelty and biological horror, has ensured its appearance both directly and indirectly in literature across the ages. Writers have recognized its potency as a symbol of ultimate, almost unthinkable suffering. For instance, William Shakespeare, in The Winter's Tale, describes a punishment with chilling parallels. A character speaks of being flayed alive, then coated in honey, and left for wasps and flies. Later, H. Rider Haggard, in his novel The Ancient Allen, explicitly features a death by the boat, drawing directly from Plutarch's account to depict a scene of profound terror. While direct visual depictions of Scaphism from antiquity are non-existent, the horrifying imagery associated with it has undoubtedly fueled the artistic imagination, particularly in genres exploring the macabre and the extremes of human experience. The central image of a trapped, helpless individual exposed to the elements and slowly being consumed by insects is so visceral that it resonates deeply. Artists exploring themes of torment, divine retribution, or the grotesque have often touched upon similar visual elements. The suffering body, the indifferent cruelty of nature, and the slow descent into decay, all of which are core components of the Scaphism narrative. In more contemporary times, the spectre of Scaphism continues to haunt the darker corners of creative expression. Horror films, dark fantasy novels, and certain types of historical fiction sometimes explore scenarios that echo its unique brand of torment. The concept of a slow, inescapable, biologically driven death where the victim is conscious of their own horrifying decomposition remains a powerful tool for evoking profound discomfort and terror in audiences. The enduring fascination with the forbidden, the terrible, and the boundaries of human endurance means that Scaphism, or scenarios inspired by it, will likely continue to surface in artistic and literary works. Beyond its literal representations, Scaphism functions as a potent and disturbing metaphor in storytelling and cultural discourse. It can symbolize an inescapable, drawn-out suffering, a situation where an individual or group is trapped and slowly destroyed by forces beyond their control or even by their own internal decay. It can represent a psychological prison, a system meticulously designed to break the human spirit through relentless degradation. Its almost mythic status as the worst punishment imaginable lends it a unique power as a symbol of dehumanization and the ultimate betrayal of the body by its environment, a truly horrific fate. The sheer inventiveness behind such a method speaks volumes about a capacity for cold, calculated brutality, pushing the boundaries of what one human could inflict upon another. Whether Scaphism was a widespread reality, a rare atrocity, or a significantly embellished tale, its story serves as a chilling and extreme benchmark in the academic study of historical punishment and state-sanctioned violence. It frequently appears in discussions about the evolution of justice, the nature of torture, and the diverse ways societies have sought to control their populations through fear. Its very extremity makes it a focal point for analysis, prompting critical questions about the limits of power, the definition of barbarity, and the mechanisms by which such horrifying practices can be conceived and implemented by governing bodies. The narrative of Scaphism compels us to confront the disturbing depths of human ingenuity when applied to the infliction of pain. The meticulous planning evidently involved in its described method, the force-feeding, the use of milk and honey to induce diarrhea and attract insects, the confinement designed for prolonged exposure, speaks to a chilling level of psychological understanding aimed at maximizing terror and suffering. It forces a stark confrontation with the darker potentialities of human nature, where intellectual effort and systematic organization are perversely channeled into creating such elaborate mechanisms of agony. A grim reminder of this capacity. In contemporary debates surrounding torture and human rights, Scaphism, however distant historically, remains relevant as an example of ultimate cruelty. It starkly underscores why international conventions and legal frameworks prohibiting torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment are so fundamentally vital for civilized societies. The profound degradation and suffering inherent in Scaphism stand in direct opposition to the concept of human dignity. Its horrifying details help to define the very boundaries of what is considered unacceptable state behavior, galvanizing the resolve to prevent any recurrence of such atrocities in any form anywhere in the world. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of Scaphism is that of a profound and multifaceted warning. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the potential for cruelty to become systematized, and the terrifying depths to which inhumanity can sink. It highlights the critical importance of empathy, humane justice systems, and constant societal vigilance against the normalization or acceptance of any form of brutality. Though a dark chapter, its story serves as a stark reminder of why humanity must strive to uphold dignity and compassion, and why even the most disturbing aspects of our past must be studied, to learn, to remember, and to ensure such horrors are never repeated. Scaphism stands apart in the grim annals of human punishment. It was not merely a method of execution, it was a meticulously engineered descent into unimaginable agony, a symphony of suffering composed with chilling precision. The combination of prolonged exposure, inescapable confinement, and the grotesque use of the victim's own body to attract their tormentors created a unique tableau of horror. Its design was not for a quick end, but for a slow, conscious unmaking. This was no swift justice, it was calculated, protracted torment, a truly diabolical form of retribution. Every detail seemed crafted to maximize both physical pain and psychological devastation, setting it in a category of its own. From the victim's perspective, Scaphism represented a living nightmare from which there was no awakening, only a deepening dread. Imagine the dawning realization. Death would not come swiftly. Instead, it would arrive as a slow creeping tide of decay, infestation, and unbearable pain. They were forced to witness their own body's grotesque transformation, to feel the relentless activity of insects, to endure the gnawing hunger and parching thirst, only to be met with the cruel sustenance designed to prolong their ordeal. This awareness, this conscious participation in one's own agonizing dissolution, is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this ancient horror, a state of absolute helplessness. The psychological devastation wrought by Scaphism was as profound as the physical torment. All dignity was systematically stripped away. The public nature of the punishment, in many cases, amplified this humiliation, turning the victim into a grotesque spectacle for others to witness. They were reduced from a human being to a decaying object, a living feast for vermin, a symbol of the state's ultimate power to degrade and destroy. Hope was methodically extinguished, replaced by an unyielding despair. The mind, trapped within a failing body, could only spiral into madness or a desperate longing for an end that came too slowly, too painfully. This method was in its essence a journey into a fate considered by many to be truly worse than death itself. The slow biological breakdown, the constant sensory assault of filth and pain, and the utter abandonment to the forces of nature and vermin, all while consciousness flickered, defined Scaphism. It was a punishment that sought to obliterate not just life, but the very essence of humanity, leaving behind a chilling testament to the depths of cruelty. The sheer inventiveness behind such a method speaks volumes about a capacity for cold, calculated brutality, pushing the boundaries of what one human could inflict upon another. Whether Scaphism was a common practice, a rare extremity, or a tale amplified by historical bias, its narrative has undeniably carved a deep and lasting scar on human memory. It has become a potent and enduring symbol of ultimate cruelty, a byword for the most depraved forms of punishment imaginable. The very name evokes a visceral reaction, a shudder of disbelief that such a fate could be conceived, let alone inflicted. Its legacy is not just in historical texts, but in the collective consciousness, representing a nadir of human behavior, a dark benchmark against which other atrocities are often instinctively, if silently, compared. The story of Scaphism, however debated its specifics, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and punishment in past societies. It highlights the extreme lengths to which regimes might go to assert dominance and instill terror. The fear generated by the mere possibility of such an end would have been a powerful tool of social control, a chilling deterrent whispered in hushed tones. Its existence, even as a narrative, challenges our perceptions of ancient justice, reminding us that civilizations capable of great achievements could also harbor practices of profound barbarity. It serves as a grim reminder of the shadows that can lurk beneath the veneer of order. The memory of Scaphism, preserved through centuries, continues to serve a vital, albeit somber, purpose in the modern world. It underscores the profound importance of human dignity and the ongoing struggle for humane treatment for all individuals, Even those accused of the most heinous crimes, reflecting on such extreme historical cruelty reinforces our commitment to legal systems that eschew torture and degrading punishments. It reminds us that the capacity for such acts, however deeply buried, may still reside within human nature, necessitating constant vigilance and the upholding of ethical principles in justice and governance to prevent their re-emergence. Ultimately, Scaphism remains a dark monument in the landscape of human history. It is a chilling testament to the inventive cruelty of which mankind is capable, a warning etched in the annals of suffering. While the dust of empires has long settled, the echo of the boats lingers, a disturbing reminder of how power can corrupt, how justice can be perverted, and how the human body and spirit can be subjected to torments that defy easy comprehension. Its story, horrifying as it is, implores us to learn from the darkest chapters of our past, to cherish compassion, and to relentlessly strive for a world where such calculated inhumanity finds no place.